if you look closely, is they have two different y-axes. 5 of the 6 countries, China, Russia, Britain, India, and Saudi Arabia, have a left axis. And the left axis shows military spending in billions of constant US dollars from 2020, going from $0 to $300 billion. And on the right axis, which is a separate y-axis, it doesn't start at 0, it starts at 400 billion, and that axis is only for the United States. So technically, it's not false, but it is extremely misleading. It is one of the most misleading graphs I have ever seen in my life. Now, I wrote an article about this over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. I linked to it in the description below, which has all the sources for people who want to check this out themselves. Now, in this article, I included a modified version of this graph from the US Fed, and it shows all of the country's military spending, but on the same axis. This axis going from $0 to $1 trillion. And you can see that no other country on earth comes even remotely close to US military spending. It's way higher than all of the other countries, including China, which once again spends 1/3 of what the US military spends. And that's just according to the official US military budget, by the way, because we know that the US military spends hundreds of billions of dollars more per year in ways that are not really shown in the direct military budget, other forms of spending. That's why the Pentagon, the US Defense Department, has failed every single audit that it's ever tried. And there are tens of trillions of dollars of unaccounted spending that the Pentagon has been responsible for, the US military. So this is what the actual accurate graph should look like. But of course, that's not what they publish. Now let's take a look here briefly at the report that the St. Louis Fed published along with this graph. And it's titled, Military Expenditures, How Do the Top Spending Nations Compare? And if you actually read the text of the report, it tells a very different story compared to the very misleading graph, because they have to acknowledge the facts. And they say, the US had by far the largest military budget at $767.8 billion in 2021. And that is, by the way, adjusted for inflation using constant 2020 dollars. China's military spending that year was $270 billion. That is 1/3 roughly of what the United States spent. And yet here is the extremely misleading graph they did with 2 separate y-axes. I mean, if you submitted this to a Statistics 101 class, your teacher would fail you. But because we're in a new Cold War, Washington loves this kind of propaganda, and the Fed was given a golden star for its service in the new Cold War against Beijing. Now, there are other graphs in here that tell a much better story. And there were people who defended this misleading graph, saying, well, the point of the graph is to show how much Chinese military spending has increased. And of course, it's extremely misleading because it strongly implies that China is spending more than the United States. But let's actually look at military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. If you look at this graph, you can see that actually, since the 1990s, China's military spending as a percentage of GDP has decreased since 1992. It has not increased, it has decreased. And since 1994, roughly, it has been basically stable. That is to say that if you measure Chinese military expenditure, its military spending, as a percentage of the size of the entire economy, the gross domestic product, you see that China is not increasing its GDP. It's not increasing its military spending as a percentage of GDP. In reality, the reason that we see in gross terms an increase in Chinese military spending is because it's directly proportional to the growth of the Chinese economy. So as China's economy becomes larger, its military spending increases at an exact same proportional level. And the Fed says this, it acknowledges this. They write, China's 2021 defense spending was 1.7% of its 2021 GDP, which was the lowest share among the 6 nations in the figure. What does that mean? It means that among the 6 largest military spenders in the world, the United States, China, Russia, India, Britain, Saudi Arabia, among those countries, China spends the least in terms of its percentage of GDP. And yet, if you looked at this graph, you would think that China is spending more than the United States. Again, this is new Cold War propaganda. Now, of course, the vast majority of people are not going to read the text of a report from this, a boring report from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. I mean, only journalists and maybe some economists actually read this stuff. So if you go into the weeds here, they admit China's defense to GDP ratio has been almost a flat line since 1992 at around 2%, actually less than 2%, suggesting that its defense outlays have grown almost proportionately to its GDP. This means that the rapid rise of China's defense spending, seen in the first figure, reflects the rapid rise in GDP. That is to say, it's not because China is some great threat that's planning on colonizing the world, which is obviously the propaganda that the US government and its propaganda mouthpieces in the media have been pushing for years, with their claims of, that China is supposedly colonizing Africa, says the European colonizers who literally did colonize Africa. So that's the propaganda narrative. And then they acknowledge, well, actually, China is not some great military threat. Its military spending as a percentage of GDP has been constant, has been completely the same since the early 1990s as a percentage of GDP. But China has gotten significantly richer since the early 1990s. The only country in the world that consistently over time spends more of a percentage on its military as a percentage of GDP is Saudi Arabia. The United States, for the most part, spends more as a percentage of GDP on its military, although in the past few years, Russia has, and that's because there was a huge increase in 2014 because of the U.S. Organized coup in Ukraine that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected neutral government in February 2014 and installed a pro-Western regime, and that set off a civil war, and Russia was preparing for this proxy war with NATO, which is why Russia's military spending as a percentage of GDP increased. But if you look during the so-called war on terror, the U.S., excluding Saudi Arabia, the U.S. was the world's largest military spender as a percentage of GDP. And this report at the Fed acknowledges that all nations except China spent less than a tenth of U.S. military spending in 2021, and China spent around 1/3 of the U.S. military spending. This other graph shows the percentage of these countries' military spending as a percentage of U.S. military spending, and we can see that China still spends around 33-34% of what the U.S. spends on its military. So the most accurate representation of U.S. military spending, showing just how out of control it is compared to the rest of the world, is from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. And every year they compile this information that shows these graphs that show how the U.S. spends over half of its discretionary budget on the military, and how the U.S. spends more than the 9 largest countries that spend 9 largest military spenders combined. And these are the numbers from May of 2022. And this shows that as of 2022, although that figure has increased, the U.S. was spending $801 billion on its military that year, whereas the combined 9 next largest, which includes China's, India's, Britain's, Russia's, France's, Germany's, Saudi Arabia's, Japan's, and South Korea's military spending, all of them combined was $777 billion. So no other country comes even remotely close. I should also point out that China has a population of 1.3 billion people. That is to say, China's population is approximately 4 times larger than the US population. So China, if you actually did per capita military spending, the US spends 12 times more roughly on its military than China does if we're looking at per capita spending. Now, also keep in mind when we're talking about the fact that the US spends more on its military from the next 9 largest spenders combined. Keep in mind that most of those other 9 largest spenders are U.S. allies. So India, for instance, the third largest military spender in the world, but although India also has 1.4 billion people in its population, so another massive country, India is a U.S. ally. Now, yes, India does have an independent foreign policy. It's an ally of Russia. It's part of the BRICS, but India has very complicated negative relations with China, and India is part of the anti-China NATO that the U.S. created, which is called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So India is a U.S. ally. Britain is basically an extension of the U.S. empire. It's the little brother of U.S. imperialism. Russia is, of course, U.S. One of the top U.S. so-called threats. The Pentagon declared China and Russia to be the top so-called threats to the United States. So obviously China and Russia are not U.S. allies, but France is a U.S. ally. It's part of NATO. Germany is a U.S. ally. It's part of NATO. Germany has been militarily occupied by the U.S. since the end of World War II. And Saudi Arabia is historically a U.S. ally, although it's kind of maintaining a more independent foreign policy these days. Japan is another U.S. ally that has been militarily occupied by the U.S. since the end of World War II. And South Korea is another U.S. ally that has been militarily occupied by the U.S. since the 1950s. So even when we're looking at U.S. military spending compared to these other countries, we should keep in mind that really what we're talking about is, over $1 trillion spent by the U.S. military and its allies compared to around $300 billion spent by China and Russia. It's completely not in any way remotely similar. And another really good way of looking at this is looking at data showing countries' military expenditure per capita. This is looking at countries' military spending adjusted according to the size of their populations. And here we can see that the world's largest military spender per capita is apartheid Israel. Apartheid Israel spends around $2,500 US per person as of 2020 in constant 2019 dollars, followed by the United Arab Emirates and then the United States. Although the UAE data is actually old. So the world's largest military spender per capita is apartheid Israel, and then the second largest spender per capita is the United States, and Israel is basically the 51st U.S. state. So these are two basically parts of the same imperial system that spend around $2,400, $2,500 per person on their militaries. Note how in this list of countries by military expenditure per capita, China and Russia are not even on the list of the largest, the top spenders. But you know who is? Apartheid Israel, the US, the Gulf monarchies, Norway, another member of NATO, Australia, another member of the Quad, the anti-China NATO, South Korea, Britain. They are all on this list of the largest military spenders per capita. So looking at China's military spending and then saying that, oh, well, China's military spending has increased. I mean, it's a useless statistic. What we should actually look at is China's military spending, one, per capita as the size of its population, and two, as a percentage of its GDP. And if we just look at the gross numbers, this is what the actual graph should look like, not the new Cold War propaganda published by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. I have to say that I've never seen this done to a U.S. government agency or body, but in response, Twitter actually created this little box at the bottom that says, while this information is correct, the graph is poorly formatted with a separate y-axis on the right side, which only applies to the U.S. budget. This may make it seem like China has a higher military budget than the U.S. when the reverse is true. So even Twitter is calling out this ridiculous new Cold War propaganda from the U.S. government. These are what the so-called experts in the U.S. government are doing to try to scare people and try to portray China as some kind of threat. And as always, here at Geopolitical Economy Report, I will be reporting regularly on these deceptions and this propaganda in the new Cold War. I'm Ben Norton. If you want to support this program, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support, or you can become a patron over at patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. In the description below, I have a link with all the sources that I discussed today, and you can do more research for yourself. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
We are defending freedom and property.
The proxy war in Ukraine between NATO and Russia is escalating. The United States and Germany announced that they're going to be sending tanks to Ukraine to help fight this proxy war against Russia. Germany's foreign minister said that Europe is at war with Russia. And at the same time, they're actually profiting from this war, not just in the sense of the tens of billions of dollars in arms sales that have been sent to Ukraine. So clearly the military-industrial complex is making a killing off of killing. But at the same time, we also see that Ukraine is essentially selling its country to foreign corporations. It's one of the most blatant events in history that I can think of in which a country is quite literally being sold off to foreign capital. It's quite shocking and at an incredible rate. And this is being overseen, of course, by NATO and the US, but also by Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky has essentially made it clear that he is willing to sell off all of Ukraine's assets, privatizing state companies, privatizing state assets, natural resources, even land, and selling it off to foreign corporations. And this kind of extreme neoliberal economic policy was reflected in a speech that Zelensky gave to a corporate lobby group in Florida. And in this speech, Zelensky thanked U.S. corporations, including BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, and also the largest investment banks in the world, Goldman Sachs and J.P. Chase. He thanked them for investing in Ukraine, that is, buying off Ukrainian assets. And he also thanked the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk for sending technology through his Starlink company. So I'll just show a clip here of this very shocking speech, and then I'll talk more about what it really means.
Together, we'll be able to start the difficult work of rebuilding Ukraine, our cities, our economy, our infrastructure. It is already clear that this will be the largest economic project of our time in Europe. It is obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth. We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way. Your brilliant defense systems, such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises. We are waiting for Patriots. We are looking closely at Abrams. Thousands of such examples are possible, and everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communication to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I believe that freedom must always win. And I invite you to work with us right now.
Note how in this speech, Zelensky said that everyone can become a big business if they invest in Ukraine and buy up Ukrainian assets. He's saying very clearly, you can become rich buying up my country. He's selling his country quite literally to Wall Street and giving these speeches to corporate lobby organizations in the United States and inviting them to buy more and more of his country. As always, I have an article about this over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. I have that linked in the description below, and you can find all links to all of the sources that I discussed today, so you can do your own fact checking. Now, we have this speech because it was published by the office of the Ukrainian president, Zelensky's official office, the official website, and they published a transcript of the speech on January 23rd, and it's titled, "After the End of the War, American Business Can Become a Locomotive of Global Economic Growth." And this was a speech that Zelensky gave to the meeting of the National Association of State Chambers. This is a corporate lobby group in the US, and it's a meeting of the different representatives of the state chambers of commerce. These are organizations that lobby on behalf of big corporations in different states across the United States. So he's speaking to a bunch of corporate executives in the United States. And in this speech, Zelensky's rhetoric was aggressively neoliberal. He talked about basically that governing Ukraine is like running a business. He said that, we have to make these decisions like you all make in these large corporations. And he also portrayed the proxy war in Ukraine as a battle between the Western-led capitalist order and evil authoritarian Russia. And he said, we are defending freedom and property. He said that. We are defending property. Here's that quote.
We are defending freedom and property thanks to the leadership of the United States of America, which has consolidated the world in defense of freedom. We see how to win this battle.
Now, we should keep in mind that while the Ukrainian leader is giving these speeches to U.S. corporate lobby groups, he is viciously attacking Ukrainian workers. In fact, under Zelensky, and even before Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Ukraine has imposed some of the world's most aggressive anti-worker laws. And this can be clearly seen even in this report, this press release from the so-called Solidarity Center of the U.S. Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO. I want to stress, this organization is funded by the U.S. government, the Solidarity Center, and it's notorious for viciously attacking Russia and China and Venezuela. Any organization, any foreign government that the U.S. considers its so-called adversary and wants to organize regime change, the Solidarity Center is always attacking them. This is funded by the U.S. government, but because it's affiliated with the AFL-CIO, which, by the way, leftists jokingly throughout the first Cold War often called the AFL-CIO the AFL-CIA because it was an attempt by the U.S. government to co-opt the labor movement and make unions anti-communist and pro-imperialist. So anyway, the point is that despite the fact that this organization is funded by the U.S. government and very pro-U.S., they have constantly criticized the Ukrainian regime for brutally attacking its own workers and taking away their rights. This is an August press release that's titled "More Attacks on Rights of Ukrainian Workers." And they say, in a significant assault on workers' rights in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky signed into law legislation that deprives about 73% of workers of their right to union protection and collective bargaining. The anti-labor law, the anti-worker law passed by the Ukrainian regime, it has references to so-called freedom of contract, which is the kind of stuff, like Republicans in the U.S. love to talk about. And what this means, they say in this press release, is it, quote, provides ample room for employers to prescribe literally any provisions in a contract, while workers desperate for jobs during a pandemic and a war will likely accept such provisions. So this is a law that takes away basically all of the workers' rights of 3/4 of Ukrainian workers and allows large corporations to do anything that they want. And increasingly, these large corporations are Western corporations, U.S. corporations, and European corporations that are investing in Ukraine and exploiting Ukrainian workers who have no rights. They can't form a union. They have no collective bargaining rights. And this Solidarity Center press release points out that this anti-worker law in Ukraine, it is valid during martial law, but labor experts express concern that it may be extended. So after the war ends, whatever's left of the Ukrainian regime is going to continue to impose this brutal anti-worker legislation. And they say that this is the latest in a string of legislation targeting workers' rights and the ability of unions to function freely in Ukraine. And this has been for the past 2 years. So this is before Russia invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainian regime was imposing these brutal anti-workers laws. And they note that lobbyists have pushed laws in the Ukrainian parliament that reduce wages, limit the use of formal contracts that ensure workers have job stability, and weaken their collective voice by targeting unions. So while Zelensky is giving these speeches to U.S. corporate lobbies, he is attacking the rights of his workers while he claims to be supporting them. And you can see this so clearly reflected in the extreme neoliberal rhetoric in the speech, where he's just talking about the importance of the free market and privatization and foreign investment in corporations and how great the U.S. is. He begins the speech thanking the globally important economic strength of America and the corporate executives that he's speaking. He thanks them for giving him the opportunity to address them. And of course, because he's speaking for an audience of largely right-wing people in the US, he uses this as an opportunity to attack the evil Iranian regime. On two different occasions, he criticized the so-called Iranian regime, calling it Russia's so-called terrorist ally. Here are those clips.
Even though Russia has found a terrorist ally in the face of the Iranian regime, which supplies weapons to the Kremlin. This is exactly what connects the Kremlin with some anti-democratic regimes in various parts of the world, such as the Iranian regime, what makes them accomplices.
He uses all of this patriotic U.S. rhetoric about how great the United States is, which is defending freedom in the world. And then he says, we are defending freedom and property. Emphasis on the latter, emphasis on property. And then he says, you know, this is the clip I showed earlier. This is where he says that rebuilding Ukraine is going to be, quote, the largest economic project of our time in Europe. And he's saying that who is going to oversee this reconstruction in Ukraine? It's going to be American business that will become the locomotive. So he's saying that U.S. corporations are going to profit from rebuilding and privatizing Ukraine. Ukraine as a country, I mean, there's a Freudian slip. Ukraine as a country is becoming a company. It's becoming privatized as a country. And I mean, this is like what the United States did to Russia in the 1990s. After the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the counter-revolution, the U.S. brought in all of these neoliberal Chicago boy economists who privatized everything in Russia basically overnight, selling everything off to billionaire oligarchs and foreign corporations. And by the way, that neoliberal shock therapy imposed on Russia in the 1990s led to millions of deaths. That's according to a report by UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. In 2001, they published a report called A Decade of Transition, focusing on the impact of 10 years of neoliberal capitalist shock therapy that was imposed on former Soviet Russia. And they said that the result was 3.2 million excess deaths in the 1990s, mostly among adult men, that would not have occurred if mortality rates had remained at 1989 levels as they were in the Soviet Union. 18 million children were pushed into poverty, living on $2 per day. 1.5 million were pushed into public care. There was a massive outbreak of HIV, tuberculosis, high levels of child malnutrition. I mean, we're talking about low levels of school enrollment. Fewer children. The number of children under 5 has fallen by more than a third. Conflict, violence, threats to basic public health services, education funding dropping. So those were the great, spectacular results of the neoliberal capitalist shock therapy imposed on Russia in the 1990s under the alcoholic U.S. puppet Boris Yeltsin, which oversaw a massive disaster. That's why Vladimir Putin became so popular in Russia, because he imposed economic discipline on the oligarchs. He renationalized certain parts of the Russian economy, including the natural resources, the oil and the gas, some of the banks. So that's why Putin became popular, is because of the economic disaster unleashed on Russia in the 90s. And now that's exactly what the West is trying to do in Ukraine. They're bringing back the exact same policies. And Zelensky spelled them out very clearly in this speech for the U.S. corporate lobby. He's thanked the giants of the international financial and investment world, such as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Now, of course, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are two of the world's largest investment banks, but He also named BlackRock. And this is important. What is BlackRock? BlackRock is a massive corporate asset manager. So it manages the assets of rich people and corporations around the world. And it has over $8 trillion worth of assets that it manages. And BlackRock is overseeing the reconstruction in Ukraine. This is a press release from the Ukrainian president's office from December 2022. It's titled, "President Discussed with the CEO of BlackRock the coordination of efforts to rebuild Ukraine." And it discusses how the Ukrainian Western-backed leader, Zelensky, held a conference meeting with Larry Fink, who is a billionaire and the CEO of BlackRock. And they discussed how BlackRock is going to oversee the funding of reconstruction. So it's going to basically oversee reconstruction in Ukraine. Ukraine outsourced its reconstruction to one of the world's most powerful corporations, which is, of course, a U.S. corporation. And they say in this press release that BlackRock has been working for several months on a project to advise the Ukrainian government on how to structure the country's reconstruction funds. Volodymyr Zelensky and Larry Fink agreed to focus in the near term on coordinating the efforts of all potential investors and participants in the restructuring of our country, channeling investment into the most relevant and impactful sectors of the Ukrainian economy. So, Ukraine as a country is being sold off to foreign corporations. Reconstruction is being overseen by BlackRock. And I want to stress this again. This is one of the most powerful corporations on earth. This is a really good article that was published at the website The Conversation in 2017. It's called "These Three Firms Own Corporate America." And what are those three firms? BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These are the three biggest asset managers in the United States. They refer to them as the Big Three. And they note here that in the S&P 500, which is the index on Wall Street, the stock exchange in which the 500 largest, most important companies in the United States, their shares are sold, so investors can buy and sell their shares, right? So the S&P 500 represents 500 of the most powerful corporations on earth, including Apple, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, General Electric, Coca-Cola, and many more. Well, among those 500 largest U.S. corporations, the Big Three asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, are the largest shareholder in 90% of those companies. We are talking about some of the largest corporations, the largest asset managers in human history. And we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars worth of assets here. And this is the company, BlackRock, that is going to be overseeing reconstruction in Ukraine. And they're not going to do it based on what's best for Ukrainian workers who no longer have rights. They're going to be doing it based on what is most profitable for U.S. corporations. We are seeing the mass privatization of a country. A country is being sold off to foreign corporations. It is truly shocking, and there's little coverage of it. I mean, the lack of media attention is just as shocking. Now, if you go back to the transcript of the speech that Zelensky gave at this corporate lobby conference, you can see that he also thanks other companies like Starlink. This is the company owned by billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, who's been helping wage this proxy war against Russia. Elon Musk is also working with the U.S. government to send Starlink technology to Iran to back the U.S. government's regime change operation to try to overthrow the Iranian government. And he also thanked U.S. weapons corporations, referring to them as brilliant defense systems. And he praised, these U.S. weapons technologies like the HIMARS and Bradleys. And he says, "We are waiting for Patriot missiles. We are looking closely at Abrams tanks, which are now being sent." And he says, "Everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communications to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine." So he's saying that buy up our country. We are privatizing all of our sectors. We are opening everything up for foreign corporations to gobble up our country and to exploit our workers. So, this is what we're seeing happen in real time. It is quite shocking. This is the website of the organization that Zelensky was speaking for, the National Association of State Chambers, and this is their winter meeting they held in Boca Raton, Florida. And this is a tweet here from the Chamber of Commerce for the U.S. state of Indiana. And they say, our president is among state chamber leaders at the National Association of State Chambers winter meeting in Florida, hearing from Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky. He thanked U.S. business leaders for support and for promoting free enterprise. So there we go. This more of this neoliberal rhetoric about the free market and free enterprise and privatizations and all of that efficiency. Now, I've done a lot of reporting on this. This is by no stretch of the imagination the first time I've been reporting on this. And in the description below, I will link to 2 other reports that I did looking at how Ukraine is being sold off to U.S. corporations. One is an article and a video I did back in September. Zelensky he opened the New York Stock Exchange by ringing the bell, at least virtually through, Zoom or whatever, like a video stream. And he announced that his country is open for business and announced $400 billion in state sell-offs to U.S. corporations. And the Ukrainian government published a press release that was spread out by the financial press. Again, this is directly from the Ukrainian government, this press release. And they announced $400 billion in investment options through the Advantage Ukraine program, including public-private partnerships, privatization, and private ventures. How many times can they use the word private? I mean, they're just emphasizing this neoliberal capitalist rhetoric. And they boasted that this mass sell-off of Ukraine is being overseen by a USAID-supported project team of investment bankers and researchers. USAID is the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's basically an arm of the CIA. It's a front for the CIA. And this press release from the Ukrainian government, from the Ukrainian Minister of Culture and Information Policy, they quote the president of the New York Stock Exchange, who says this is a great opportunity to profit from selling off Ukraine's assets to U.S. corporations. They also have the CEO of Google and Alphabet. They have the president of Microsoft. So they have people from huge U.S. corporations talking about how great of an opportunity this is to buy up Ukraine. He's selling off Ukraine. And I talked about Zelensky's economic policies with the economist Michael Hudson, and he compared what Zelensky is doing to what Chile's far-right dictator Augusto Pinochet did to Chile with the mass privatization of the Chilean economy after the CIA-backed coup in 1973 overthrew the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Now, at the same time, the same day when Zelensky opened the New York Stock Exchange in September, he also published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "Invest in the Future of Ukraine." And in this article, Zelensky boasted about how he's imposing all these economic policies that make it very profitable for foreign corporations to invest in the country. He's cutting labor laws, cutting workers' protections. I mean, it really is the mass sell-off, the mass privatization of an entire country. And finally, I have another report I did about this, which includes an article and a video and a podcast. And it talks about these conferences that were held with Western government officials and representatives of corporations meeting in Switzerland in July of 2022 for the so-called Ukraine Recovery Conference, which before that was called the Ukraine Reform Conference. And in these conferences, going back several years after the U.S. organized coup in Ukraine in 2014, overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected neutral government and installed a pro-Western puppet regime which imposed neoliberal shock therapy. In these conferences, these Western government officials and corporate executives were salivating over the possibility to profit off of privatizing Ukraine and selling off its state assets. And in this most recent conference, they changed the name from the Ukraine Reform Conference to the Ukraine Recovery Conference. But they published a bunch of reports in which they called for cutting labor laws and workers' protections, opening up markets in scare quotes, dropping tariffs, deregulating Ukrainian industries, and selling, this is an exact quote, state-owned enterprises to private investors. So this is what NATO and the US and the EU are actually fighting for in Ukraine. Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, says that Europe is at war with Russia. This is what they're actually fighting for. They are fighting for corporate profits, to profit off of privatization of Ukraine, of the mass selling off of state assets, exploitation of Ukrainian workers, so US and European corporations can profit. This is what they're fighting for. It's not freedom. It's not democracy. Ukraine is not a democracy. In fact, Zelensky at the same time has illegalized all communist and socialist parties. It is basically illegal to be part of a leftist party in Ukraine today. Basically, all of the major leftist parties have been made illegal. Only right-wing, pro-Western, pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist, pro-NATO parties are allowed in Ukraine. And of course, Zelensky, I mean, he's a puppet. Zelensky doesn't really control anything. Zelensky, when he ran for president, he actually, ironically, ran as the peace candidate. He spoke Russian on his presidential campaign. And the Western media, when he was running for president, was concerned he would be too pro-Russian because he was running against the Western-backed right-wing puppet Poroshenko, who he's a billionaire oligarch known as, Ukraine's Willy Wonka, chocolate king, billionaire, and he was imposing all of these pro-Western neoliberal policies. So these are not new policies under Zelensky. And then Zelensky won the presidency, promising peace. He promised that he was going to try to negotiate some kind of settlement with Russia, and then he did the exact opposite. He did a 180 because Zelensky doesn't control anything. Zelensky is literally an actor. He's an actor. He has no political experience. He is going along with what the United States and NATO are telling him to do. And he is the figurehead, literally. He is a PR man. And as I pointed out in this article, Zelensky's speech for this U.S. corporate lobby group was very much like the kind of speech that a used car salesman would give who's trying to sell you a car and convince you it's a good deal. But he's not selling a car, he's selling his country to Western corporations. And what's so sad about this is at the end of the day, it's Ukrainians who are suffering. It's Ukrainians who are dying. It's Ukrainian workers who are being exploited. I feel so bad for them, for the Ukrainian people. And Western governments claim that in order to support the Ukrainian people, you have to support constantly escalating this war, pushing for the potential of nuclear apocalypse, pushing for a proxy war against Russia. And their goal is not to help the Ukrainian people. Their goal is to profit, as these Western corporations are profiting from sending tanks and weapons and buying up Ukrainian assets. But also, their fundamental goal, geopolitically, is to weaken Russia and overthrow the Russian government. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, admitted that. He said the U.S. goal is to weaken Russia. And by the way, Lloyd Austin, until he became Secretary of Defense, was a member of the board of directors of Raytheon, one of the top weapons corporations in the world that is making a killing off of the killing in the proxy war in Ukraine, making so many profits. And U.S. President Joe Biden admitted the same thing in Poland. He admitted the U.S. goal is to overthrow the government in the Kremlin, to overthrow Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's their goal. The Ukrainian people, unfortunately, are the collateral damage of this imperial proxy war for Western corporations to profit, to weaken Russia, and by extension, of course, to weaken China, and to prevent the emergence of a multipolar world in order to maintain U.S. imperialist unipolar hegemony, the unipolar imperialist order that the United States had after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But that world is long gone. As I report on here constantly at Geopolitical Economy Report, that world is long gone. And if you want to support this reporting that I do, support the reporting that I do here, and hear more analysis in the future, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support or patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. I appreciate any support, and I'm Ben Norton. I will see you all next time. Thanks a lot.